The street was unusually quiet when Derek Miles turned the corner onto his block. It was just past 11, and the soft yellow pools of light from the street lamps fell over the parked cars in neat lines. His own driveway sat halfway down, framed by the white picket fence he had built himself years ago. But something was off. At first he couldn't name it. His eyes scanned the familiar shapes, the fence, the gate, the small maple tree near the corner, until they landed on his Jeep. It was there, but angled differently, as if someone had pushed it or tried to park it in a hurry. Derek slowed to a stop at the curb, keeping the engine running. His driveway gate was wide open. He knew he'd locked it that morning. The heavy chain looped twice, and the padlock snapped shut. His gaze moved to the Jeep's front left wheel. The bright orange steel lock he always used was gone. That lock wasn't an ordinary one. It was reinforced, the kind used for long-term parking in high-risk areas. Cutting it required tools and a bit of nerve. Derek stepped out of his truck, the night air cool against his skin, and walked slowly up the driveway. The gravel crunched under his boots, sounding louder in the stillness. The Jeep looked fine at a glance. No broken windows, no scratches, no sign of forced entry. But that missing lock gnawed at him. He reached for the hood, checking for warmth. It was cold, so the engine hadn't been running recently. "Evening, Derek," came a voice from behind him. He turned to see Marla, his neighbor from across the street, standing with her arms folded. Her silver hair caught the lamplight, and in her right hand she held something long and metallic. It took Derek a second to recognize it. Bolt cutters. Marla didn't look the least bit sheepish. In fact, she looked almost pleased with herself. "Your Jeep was sitting there too long," she said matter-of-factly. "We can't have things looking abandoned, so I went ahead and took care of it." Derek blinked at her, processing the words. "You took care of it?" he repeated slowly. "Yes," she said, nodding as if explaining something obvious. "It's for the good of the neighborhood. People were starting to notice. I mean, who leaves a car locked up like that for weeks? It makes the place look unkempt." Derek stepped around to face her fully, his eyes flicking once more to the bolt cutters. "That was my lock," he said. "You cut it?" Marla tilted her head. "It's not like you were using it. Besides, I made sure the Jeep was fine. I just rolled it back a little so it wasn't blocking the view from the street." Blocking the view. Derek almost laughed. His driveway was on his property, tucked well inside his fence line. The idea of it obstructing anything was absurd. Still, he didn't raise his voice. He'd learned long ago that some conversations didn't benefit from quick reactions. Instead, he looked at her calmly and asked, "What did you do with the lock?" She shrugged. "Probably in my trash bin by now. It was heavy. And frankly, I don't see why you needed it in the first place. You live in a safe area. You don't need to make it look like some high-security zone." Derek nodded once, more to himself than to her. The missing lock wasn't, just for show, and Marla had no idea why it was there. He glanced back at the Jeep, thinking about the paperwork inside the glove box, the official documents that would make her think twice if she knew. The quiet between them stretched for a moment before Marla said, "Anyway, I've got to get back. Just figured you'd want to know I helped out." She turned and walked away, bolt cutters swinging lightly in her hand. Derek stayed where he was, his gaze on the Jeep, the cool night air carrying the faint metallic scent of freshly cut steel. Derek closed the gate behind him, letting the chain hang loose for now. He wasn't about to padlock it again until he understood exactly what had happened. The moonlight cast faint silver lines across the Jeep's hood as he circled it slowly, looking for anything else out of place. The tires were clean, the mirrors unbroken, and the spare on the back was untouched. But it was the small details Derek noticed. The dust on the fender was disturbed, a faint arc showing where someone's hand had brushed it. The driver's seat was slid back an inch from where he had left it. He leaned against the Jeep and took a breath. "All right, Marla," he said quietly to himself. "Let's hear your reasoning." It didn't take long. The sound of sandals slapping against pavement announced her return, this time without the bolt cutters. She had swapped them for a notepad and pen, as if arriving to give an official briefing. "I just want you to understand," she began, flipping a page and glancing at her own handwriting. "This wasn't personal. It's about keeping everything looking maintained." Derek raised an eyebrow. "By cutting locks?" Marla nodded briskly, apparently not catching the edge in his voice. "Yes. You see, when a vehicle stays in one place too long, people start wondering. Maybe they think it's broken down. Maybe they think it's abandoned. That's when you start seeing the neighborhood slip. It's a domino effect." He folded his arms, letting her speak. "So," she continued, "I noticed you hadn't moved this Jeep in, well, I'd say 13 days. I wrote it down. Then I noticed you had a big orange wheel lock on it. That's a big visual marker. Makes people think there's a problem. So I decided to be proactive. I cut the lock and repositioned it slightly so it wasn't at such an angle to the street." Derek kept his expression neutral, though inside he was picturing the surveillance photos stored in his desk. The Jeep parked in other parts of town intentionally as part of a rotating pattern for a case. He had left it here for a reason. "Did it ever cross your mind," he asked slowly, "that maybe the lock was there for security reasons?" Marla tilted her head as if considering it for the first time. "Well, if you're worried about theft, that's what insurance is for. You don't need to make the place look like a vehicle impound lot. And really, this thing is distinctive. It stands out." Derek let his gaze drift toward the glove box. Inside, under the vehicle registration, was an envelope marked "Property" of Regional Task Force. That envelope held permits, photos, and a specialized operations log. None of it was for public eyes, least of all a curious neighbor's. He kept his voice even. "You rolled the Jeep back yourself?" "Oh, yes," Marla said, her tone light. "I'm stronger than I look. Just put it in neutral, gave it a push. I've done it before with other vehicles." "Other vehicles?" Derek asked. Marla laughed, as if it were a minor joke. "Only when it's necessary. You wouldn't believe how many people leave their cars where they shouldn't. Someone's got to take initiative." Derek studied her for a moment longer, then straightened. "All right," he said. "I hear you." She seemed pleased at his acceptance. "Good. I knew you'd understand once I explained it. We're all just trying to keep the place looking its best." Derek gave a single nod, though in his mind the decision was already forming. There were rules about tampering with official property, and her initiative had crossed a line she didn't even know existed. As she turned to leave, again he called after her, "Marla, just so I know, when exactly did you cut the lock?" She smiled over her shoulder. "Oh, about an hour ago. You were gone, so I figured it was the perfect time." Derek's eyes narrowed slightly, the pieces sliding into place. An hour ago meant the Jeep had been unsecured in the driveway with sensitive equipment inside and no one watching it. He watched her disappear into her own driveway before turning back to the Jeep, his hand resting lightly on the door handle. He'd have to check the inside, every compartment, before the night was over. The Jeep's door creaked softly as Derek opened it, the sound carrying in the stillness of the night. He slipped into the driver's seat, shutting the door behind him, and immediately scanned the dashboard. Nothing seemed out of place, no loose wires, no disturbed switches. But years of working with sensitive equipment had trained him to look closer. His eyes shifted to the glove box. It looked perfectly ordinary, but Derek knew that appearance was a layer of security in itself. He reached forward and popped it open. Inside lay the usual stack of paperwork, registration, proof of insurance, and the folded street maps he always kept on hand, but beneath them was what mattered. A black envelope with a red seal marked property of Regional Task Force. The edges of the envelope were crisp, unbent, exactly as he had left them. He let out a slow breath. The contents hadn't been touched. Still, he slid the envelope out and checked inside. The operational permits were there, as were the laminated access cards, each with its unique code. And in a smaller interior pocket were printed photos of 2 vehicles currently under observation in an unrelated case. Marla had been lucky, or perhaps just uninterested in paperwork, because if she had opened this envelope, the situation would have gone from irritating to critical in an instant. Derek replaced everything exactly as it had been and shut the glove box, but he didn't start the engine. Instead, he sat back, hands on the wheel, and thought about the bigger picture. The Jeep wasn't just his property, it was a functioning part of an ongoing operation. It had a specific appearance, specific locations it rotated through, and a reason for being here untouched. Now that chain of control had been broken. He turned to the passenger seat, checking the small lockbox bolted to the floor. The keypad glowed, faintly when he tapped it, and his code unlocked it with a muted click. Inside were only basic tools tonight, no sensitive electronics, but the point was the same. Marla had removed a barrier that wasn't meant to be removed. Derek shut the lockbox and leaned back again. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of quiet that made every small sound stand out. Somewhere a sprinkler system clicked on. A porch. Light flickered across the street. He thought about walking over to Marla's house right now and showing her the badge that was also tucked in the glove box. It would end the conversation quickly, but it would also raise questions. Questions about why he had a task force badge, why the Jeep was part of an operation, and why it couldn't be treated like any other personal vehicle. That wasn't the kind of attention he needed. Instead, he decided on another approach. Information first, confrontation second. If Marla had touched other vehicles before, she might have a pattern. He wanted to know how far her initiative had gone. He opened the center console and pulled out a small, flat notepad. It wasn't part of his official gear, just a personal log he kept for things like this. On the top page, he wrote, "Lock cut, 10:05 p.m. by neighbor Marla. Jeep moved 2 feet back. No visible damage. Possible prior history of similar actions. The act of writing it down focused his mind. Once he had the details documented, he felt the shift. This was no longer an annoyance. It was a reportable incident. With the note complete, Derek locked the Jeep, this time with a smaller secondary wheel clamp he kept for travel. It wasn't as visible, but it was enough for the moment. As he stepped back, he glanced toward Marla's house. Her curtains were drawn, but a faint glow from a television flickered inside. She was settled in for the night, unaware of just how close she had come to tampering with something far more important than she realized. Derek turned toward his own house, his mind already moving ahead. Tomorrow, he'd make the quiet call that would change how this situation played out. But tonight, he was content to let the Jeep sit exactly where it was, under his watch. The next morning broke with the faint hum of lawn mowers in the distance and the smell of fresh coffee drifting from Derek's kitchen. He sat at the small breakfast table, his phone resting face down beside his mug. He had already made a couple of calls, quiet, casual ones, to check in with a few contacts. Nothing official yet, just a heads up. Through the window, he could see the Jeep exactly where he had left it, the smaller wheel clamp locked tight. The chain on the gate was back in place too, but this time he had run it through a reinforced eyelet. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. When he opened it, Marla stood there holding a clipboard and smiling like she was about to deliver good news. "Morning," she said brightly. "Just thought I'd drop by to follow up on yesterday. I hope you had time to think about what I said." Derek leaned against the doorframe. "I did think about it." "And?" she prompted, tilting her head with expectation. "And he said evenly, Cutting locks on other people's property isn't something you should be doing. Marla's smile didn't falter. I knew you might take it that way at first, but really, it's for the best. You've got to look at the bigger picture. One vehicle sitting too long can give the whole street a neglected feel. That Jeep of yours, as nice as it is, sticks out. It's almost like a spotlight saying something's wrong. Derek watched her carefully. Nothing's wrong with it. I'm sure it runs fine, she said, waving a dismissive hand. But perception matters. And that orange lock? I mean, come on. That's practically an invitation for gossip. It makes people wonder what you're trying to keep out. Or in. He almost laughed at that. If she knew the real reason for the lock, she'd realize how far off her assumptions were. But he kept his tone steady. You didn't ask before you acted. Well, she replied, sometimes you have to take initiative. I could have left a note or tried to call, but that just delays things. I like to solve problems quickly. Besides, you can't tell me the Jeep doesn't look better without that big, clunky thing on it. Derek didn't answer right away. He let the silence stretch, just enough to see if she'd try to fill it. She did. I mean, honestly, she continued, you might even think about changing the paint job. It's so official looking, kind of intimidating. If you want it to blend in better, maybe go with something softer. A beige or a light blue. That suggestion landed in Derek's mind like a small spark. She was talking about blending in without realizing that was exactly what the Jeep was supposed to do, just not in the way she imagined. He folded his arms. Marla, do you always move other people's vehicles? She grinned. Only when it needs to be done. And don't worry, I'm careful. I've got a good sense for these things. Derek gave a slow nod, filing that statement away. I'll keep that in mind. She took a step back toward the sidewalk. Anyway, just wanted to check in. Glad we're on the same page now. We're not, Derek said, his voice calm but firm. Her smile wavered for the first time. Oh, I think we are. You'll see. Sometimes it just takes a little time for folks to realize I was right. With that, she turned and headed down the walk, clipboard tucked under her arm, moving with the air of someone who believed they had just done a good deed. Derek closed the door, the faint click of the latch sounding louder than it should have. He stood in the quiet entryway for a moment, staring out the small side window at the Jeep. She had no idea how far she'd crossed the line, but after last night's calls, it wouldn't be long before someone else explained it to her, in a way that would leave no room for debate. The morning's coffee had long gone cold by the time Derek sat down at his desk, the blinds half closed to block the glare. His notepad from the night before sat in front of him, its top page containing the single entry about Marla's late night. Initiative. He flipped it closed and reached for his phone. Scrolling through his contacts, he paused at a name listed only as R. Allen. It wasn't a number he called often, only when something fell into a particular category. This situation qualified. He tapped the name and held the phone to his ear. Allen, a low voice answered after 2 rings. It's Derek, he said. I've got a tampering incident. No breach of contents, but the barrier was cut. Location? He gave the address. Keeping his tone even, Allen was quiet for a beat. Vehicle in question? The Jeep, Derek replied. A longer pause followed. You sure nothing inside was touched? Positive, Derek said. But it was moved. 2 feet back, by hand. That seemed to register. And who? Neighbor, Derek said, deliberately leaving the name out for now. She thought it was unsightly. Allen gave a dry exhale, halfway between a laugh and disbelief. Unsightly. All right, keep it parked there. We'll take a look later today. They ended the call without small talk. That was how it worked. With Allen, direct, minimal, no wasted words. Derek set the phone down and glanced toward the window. Outside, the neighborhood had its usual rhythm. A delivery truck making rounds, a jogger with earbuds, a dog walker waving at someone across the street. It all looked perfectly normal. But beneath that calm, the next step was already in motion. By early afternoon, Derek noticed the first shift. A dark gray sedan he recognized from previous operations rolled slowly past the house. The driver didn't stop or even glance directly at the Jeep, but Derek knew that was the point. They weren't here to be noticed. A little while later, another vehicle appeared. A white utility van with no company name, the kind that could belong to anyone from an electrician to a cable repair crew. It parked at the far end of the street. Well out of earshot, Derek made a mental note. Around 3 o'clock, Marla emerged from her front door with her usual purposeful stride, clipboard in hand. She crossed the street to chat with a neighbor, gesturing occasionally toward her own house as she talked. From her body language, Derek could tell she was recounting yesterday's events, no doubt casting herself as the one who fixed the problem. She didn't notice the gray sedan pass again or the van shift its parking spot slightly closer. Derek stayed inside, keeping himself out of view. His role for now was simple. Observe. The rest was in motion. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the street, a soft knock came at his back door. He opened it to find a man in plain clothes, late 40s, close-cropped hair, wearing a jacket despite the warm weather. "Derek," the man said quietly. "Mike," Derek replied, stepping aside to let him in. They spoke in low tones at the kitchen counter. Mike took notes, nodding occasionally. "Chain cut," Derek confirmed. "Lock removed. Jeep moved. Time frame just after 10 last night. I was out for less than 2 hours." Mike closed his notebook. "We'll take it from here. Just keep doing what you've been doing. And if she approaches you again, don't escalate. Let us handle the contact." Derek gave a single nod. Understood. When Mike left, he exited through the back gate, disappearing into the evening. Without a sound, from his front window, Derek watched Marla return to her porch, still talking animatedly on her phone. She had no idea that, in less than 24 hours, the story she was telling would take a turn she couldn't control. The next morning started quietly, though Derek could sense the difference in the air. It wasn't something the average neighbor would notice. The sounds, the pacing, the subtle presence that comes before an operation moves forward. He kept his morning routine deliberately normal. Coffee, a short walk to the mailbox, watering the front plants. Out of the corner of his eye, he caught sight of the gray sedan from yesterday, parked just far enough down the street to be inconspicuous. At 9:12 a.m., the next piece of the plan arrived. 2 dark SUVs rolled into the neighborhood, spaced a few car lengths apart, their tinted windows reflecting the soft sunlight. They didn't idle in front of Derek's house or even slow down. Instead, they continued up the street, turning into the cul-de-sac before stopping. Derek recognized them instantly, the kind of unmarked vehicles used when plainclothes work needed to look casual but ready. Both SUVs stayed parked for several minutes, engines off, doors closed. Anyone looking out a window would just see a couple of vehicles visiting a friend. Then, almost in sync, the driver doors opened. 2 men stepped out from the first SUV, both in jeans and neutral jackets. From the second, a woman joined them, carrying a slim folder in her left hand. Their body language was unhurried, relaxed, the kind of ease that hides sharp purpose. Derek stayed at his kitchen window, just out of direct sight, and watched as they headed down the street toward Marla's house. Marla was outside already, kneeling in her front yard and clipping the edges of her hedges with small garden shears. She looked up as the trio approached, setting the shears aside and standing to greet them. "Morning," one of the men said pleasantly. "We're looking into a matter involving a vehicle in the area. Mind if we ask you a couple of questions?" Even from a distance, Derek could read her expression, a mix of curiosity and mild self-importance. Of course, she said, brushing off her hands. Is this about that Jeep across the street? Because I already took care of that eyesore. The woman with the folder tilted her head slightly. Took care of it? Yes, Marla replied, confidently. It was locked up in a way that wasn't helping the neighborhood's image. I removed the lock and rolled it back a bit so it looked more natural. Honestly, it was overdue. The man nodded slowly. You cut the lock yourself? I did, she said, as if expecting approval. There was a pause, and Derek could see the faintest shift in their posture. Not aggressive, but more focused now. That vehicle is part of an active law enforcement task force, the woman said calmly. It cannot be moved or altered without authorization. Marla blinked, her mouth opening slightly before closing again. Well, I didn't know that, she said after a beat. It's just a Jeep. No markings, no sign saying, not to touch it. It doesn't need markings, the man replied evenly. And whether you knew or not, tampering with it could have compromised important work. Marla crossed her arms. Look, I was trying to help. Nobody told me it was special. That's noted, the woman said, flipping open the folder and writing something down. We're documenting this for our records. There may be follow-up questions later. Derek could see Marla trying to regain control of the conversation, but the trio wasn't giving her the space. After another brief exchange, they thanked her and walked back toward the SUVs, leaving her standing in the yard with her arms still crossed. The SUVs didn't leave right away. They lingered at the end of the street for several minutes, and Derek knew it wasn't random. They were watching reactions, taking note of who came and went, and letting their presence settle into the neighborhood's awareness. Marla eventually went back inside, moving a little quicker than before. She didn't glance toward Derek's house at all this time. He stepped back from the window and took a slow sip of coffee. The calm before the storm was over. Now, every move would count. Marla didn't come outside for the rest of the day. Curtains that were usually tied back now hung closed, and the warm glow from her kitchen was the only sign she was still home. Derek noticed the change but didn't linger on it. This was how it usually happened. The first conversation planted doubt, and the quiet that followed meant the reality was beginning to settle in. The next morning, the gray sedan returned. This time, it didn't park down the street. It pulled directly in front of Marla's house and sat idling for a few seconds before shutting off the engine. Two of the same plainclothes officers from the day before stepped out. One carried a small leather binder. They walked with measured steps up her path and knocked. After a pause, the door opened just far enough for Marla to peek out. Her voice was faint from across the street, but Derek caught enough to tell she was hesitant. "May we come in?" the taller officer asked. She stepped back reluctantly, and the door closed behind them. For nearly 40 minutes, Derek saw no movement from inside, just the occasional shadow crossing behind the curtains. When the officers finally emerged, they moved with the same calm pace as before, neither hurried nor tense. Later that afternoon, Derek got the full picture. Mike stopped by briefly, the conversation taking place at Derek's back fence. "She understands now," Mike said simply. "We showed her the paperwork. She knows whose property she interfered with, what protocols were in place, and why the lock was there in the first place." Derek nodded. "How'd she take it?" "She was quiet," Mike replied. "Tried to explain herself again, but we kept it professional. No accusations, just facts. We even showed her photos of similar vehicles in active use so she could see how easily she could have disrupted something bigger than she imagined." Derek gave a slight smirk. "I'm guessing she won't be cutting any more locks." Mike shrugged. "She's unsettled, but that's not our goal. We want her informed. The rest will take care of itself." That evening, Marla reappeared outside, watering her plants as if nothing had happened. But her usual chatter with passers-by was gone. She kept her eyes on her yard, glancing occasionally at Derek's Jeep with a new kind of caution. At one point, She walked across the street, stopping halfway up Derek's driveway. He stepped outside before she could knock. "I talked to your friends," she said, her voice steady but softer than usual. "They explained everything. I didn't realize it was tied to something official. I thought I was just fixing a little problem." Derek studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Now you know." She shifted her weight, looking like she wanted to say more but couldn't quite form the words. "I'll leave it alone from now on. That's all I ask," Derek said. She gave a quick nod and turned back toward her house. As the sun dipped below the rooftops, the neighborhood settled into its usual rhythm again. But there was a subtle shift. Fewer lingering glances at the Jeep, more quiet respect for the fact that some things weren't meant to be meddled with. Derek stood at the edge of his driveway for a while, watching the streetlights flicker on. The task force had handled it without incident, and Marla's confidence had softened into understanding. Still, he knew there was one more step before he could consider the matter closed. A final check, making sure everything was secured, and that no loose ends remained. Tomorrow, he'd take care of that. By the time dawn stretched across the neighborhood the next morning, Derek was already outside, crouched beside the Jeep. He ran his hand over the fresh wheel lock, a heavier, reinforced model that would be nearly impossible to cut without professional equipment. The polished steel glinted in the early light. He tightened the last bolt and stepped back to inspect the rest of the vehicle. No scuffs, no new scratches. The task force's discreet visit the day before had clearly made its point, across the street. Marla's curtains shifted slightly, then fell still. Derek didn't look directly at the window, but he knew she was watching. The quiet between them now carried more weight than the heated words they'd exchanged earlier in the week. The day unfolded slowly. Delivery vans made their rounds, the occasional jogger passed by, and the usual hum of neighborhood life resumed. But there was one subtle difference. The Jeep, once a target of casual interference, was now the most carefully avoided object on the block. In the afternoon, Derek walked to the community bulletin board at the end of the street. Tacked to the eye, cork between the lost pet flyers and garage sale announcements, was a new notice printed on crisp white paper. Reminder: do not move, alter, or interfere with any vehicle without written consent from its owner. Beneath the text, in smaller print, it read, "Some vehicles are used for official purposes and must remain as placed." There was no mention of Derek, the Jeep, or Marla, just a simple, clear guideline. It was enough. As he turned to leave, he spotted Mike standing across the way, leaning casually against a street lamp. He wasn't in plain clothes today. Instead, he wore jeans and a faded sweatshirt, blending into the Saturday crowd. "All buttoned up?" Mike asked as Derek approached. "Better than before," Derek replied. Mike gave a short nod. "Good. The point wasn't to embarrass her, just to make sure she understands the stakes. If she's smart, this will be the end of it." "She got the message," Derek said. Mike's gaze flicked briefly toward Marla's house, then back to Derek. "We'll keep an eye out for a bit, just in case." With that, Mike pushed off the street lamp and walked away, disappearing into the slow flow of weekend errands and casual foot traffic. That evening, Derek sat on his porch with a mug of tea. The Jeep sat in the driveway, gleaming in the amber glow of the setting sun, its new lock catching the light. A cool breeze rustled the leaves, carrying with it the muted sound of someone laughing 2 streets over. Marla emerged briefly, taking out her trash. She didn't look over, but her pace slowed as she passed within sight of the Jeep. Derek said nothing, and neither did she. The silence was enough. An understanding had been reached. As the sky deepened into twilight, Derek allowed himself a small smile. The situation had been handled without shouting, without escalation, and without unnecessary conflict. The task force's presence had done the heavy lifting, and now the neighborhood understood that some boundaries weren't meant to be crossed. The Jeep would remain exactly where it needed to be until the operation it supported was over. And, when that day came, it would drive away as quietly as it had arrived, leaving behind only the faint memory of the week the neighborhood learned a quiet but important lesson. Derek took one last sip of tea and rose from his chair. The street was calm, the Jeep was secure, and the night air carried no trace of tension. The matter was closed.